Hello, my name is Justin Golub, and I'm an associate professor of otolaryngology here at Columbia University. And today I'll be talking about age-related hearing loss and loneliness and some additional associated conditions of aging. I'm going to be presenting some data today from studies, but even if you don't believe the data that I'm going to show, I think intuitively there's something wrong with the way we approach hearing loss today across the lifespan. There's obvious ageism, and I can give you this clear example. And that example is that when we see children who have hearing loss, we treat them all the time and regardless of the level of hearing loss. If you have a child with even a small amount of hearing loss, that child gets hearing aid, wears hearing aid, and will be paid for by insurance. In contrast, in older adults, hearing loss is rarely treated with hearing aids. It's actually the exception, not the rule, and insurance typically won't cover it. Why this big disparity? The only explanation that I can come up with is ageism. And I'll get back to that later. So I'm an otolaryngologist. That is Greek for an ear, nose, and throat physician. My subspecialty is ears. I love ears. This is me operating on ears several weeks ago. And half of my time when I'm not seeing patients or operating, I am an age-related hearing loss researcher interested in the brain effects of age-related hearing loss. Of course, all my research meetings are mandatory on the beach. Just kidding. This is actually what it looks like when I do my research. It's me sitting at my desk in front of large screens. So this is an outline of the talk over the next 13 or so minutes. We'll start out with an introduction of what age-related hearing loss is. Then I'll talk about the association between hearing loss and some social consequences, then the association between hearing loss and some mental consequences, including cognition and depression, and finally some conclusions. So let's start off by addressing what age-related hearing loss actually is. So age-related hearing loss is due to the death of inner ear hair cells. These are little cells in the inner ear that have these hair-like projections like you can see on the left, and the cause is actually unknown. Unfortunately, once those hair cells die, they don't grow back. There's no medical treatment for this with drugs, for example, so we treat it with devices. We treat it with devices like hearing aids, or if the hearing loss is pretty extreme, we'll treat it with cochlear implants. But the thing is, treatment is actually quite rare. It's actually the exception, not the rule. Age-related hearing loss is also incredibly common. So this graph here shows the prevalence of hearing loss on the y-axis going from 0 to 100%. And on the x-axis is decile of life going from adolescence to about 100 years old. And you can see that as you get older, your chance of having age-related hearing loss becomes almost certain. So let's review this talk so far. We have shown that age-related hearing loss is incredibly common, and age-related hearing loss yet is rarely treated. It's one of the few conditions in older life that is rarely treated, which I just find incredibly puzzling, particularly given that it is so common. So what we're going to be talking a lot today is causation, and I just want to give a brief overview of causation. When we talk about causation, we need to talk about exposures and outcomes or diseases. This is pretty simple. The exposure is the first thing in the causal chain. The disease or outcome is the second thing in the causal chain. So an example is bacteria. Exposure causes strep throat, outcome. And throughout my talk, exposure will be coded in red and outcome will be coded in blue. So this is an MRI of a brain, and there's a slice going through the inner ear in the brain. And inner ear here is highlighted in a red rectangle, and in the blue is the brain. And these two objects are connected. They're connected by this big nerve, the cochlear nerve. And for all intents and purposes, that nerve pretty much goes in one direction. That's like 95% true. But it pretty much goes from the ear to the brain. And you could just clearly imagine that if the ear is sick and that nerve is not outputting to the brain, that could have effects on the brain. And so I'm particularly interested in the causal relationship between age-related hearing loss and cognitive impairment and dementia. And one way they could be causally related is the theme of the talk today, which is reduced socialization. How might that work? Well, people who have age-related hearing loss, they're not going out and talking as much because they can't hear the conversations anyway, so they withdraw from society. They withdraw, they're not going to great talks like this, they're not hearing my cognitively stimulating talk. Instead, they're going to sit in their room and stare at the ceiling. And you can imagine how over a few decades of later life, if you're not socializing and keeping your brain engaged, that could be bad for your mind and your memory and your cognition. Another possibility is that age-related hearing loss could cause a change in brain structure. For example, the auditory cortex, which the inner ear outputs to, will shrink a little bit if it's not receiving any sound information. And this could have cascading effects on the rest of the brain. And then there's the cognitive load theory. This means that people who have hearing loss, they can often make out the words that are being said, but they have to spend so much mental energy doing that that they have nothing left over to make memories and process the higher meaning of what is being said. Now, it's also possible that hearing loss could be non-causally related to cognitive impairment and dementia. And that's these things in purple, which in epidemiology we call confounders. These are things that cause both hearing loss and also cause cognitive impairment. And if these things explain the relationship between hearing loss and cognition, it's kind of a false relationship. There's no causal relationship, rather something else is causing both. For example, microstrokes, aka microvascular disease, that could cause damage to the ear, it could cause damage to the brain, that could create a false association. Now, when we do these epidemiology studies, we try to mathematically control for these and take them out of the equation. So that's very important to recognize. So what I'm interested in, for example, is whether hearing loss causes dementia. Association does not equal causation, as I just mentioned. That's a critical point. Causation's really hard to prove, actually. How would we prove that hearing loss causes, say, dementia? Well, one thing we could do is we could take half of listeners and we could deafen you, randomize you to the deaf group, and then we would wait 10 years and see those who are deafened if we tend to get dementia. That's obviously totally unethical and won't happen. So we could do the next best thing, which is take half of you who have hearing loss and treat it with hearing aids. Wait a decade and see if those who are treated tend to avoid dementia. This is great. This is what we need. This is what we call a randomized controlled treatment trial. We don't have this yet, but we will in a few years. So what do we have now? It's the data that I'm going to present. It's the next best thing, which is look naturally at what's occurring in the wild and see if people who tend to get hearing loss, if they tend to get dementia or depression or cognitive decline, and see what happens. So let's jump into these studies. We'll first talk about hearing loss and socialization. Helen Keller once said, blindness separates us from things, but deafness separates us from people. And I think this is really poignant and really true. If hearing loss is anything, it's clearly a social disorder. One more slide before I jump into the studies. Key take-home point here. How do we measure hearing loss? Everyone knows how we measure vision. Everyone knows what 20/20 means. Nobody knows how we measure hearing loss. I think that needs to change. So an easy way to do it is using this unit called a decibel. A decibel is how loud a sound needs to be for you to hear it. And conveniently, this scale goes from about 0, which is perfect hearing, to about 100, which is deaf, basically. And then we can chop it up into categories where 0 to 25 is normal, and it gets worse from there. And the studies I'm going to show you, we typically measure hearing loss using something called the pure tone average, which is basically this decibel just averaged over a few pitches. So again, pure tone average, that's a single number representing your hearing. Pure tone average, a single number representing your hearing, and the unit is a decibel. Bigger number, worse hearing, 0 to 25 is normal. Having said that, let's jump into a study. This was done about 5 years ago. The exposure was hearing, as I just explained, and the outcome was this thing called the UCLA Loneliness Scale. And there were about 150 people. It was cross-sectional, meaning a single slice in time. And the study adjusted for a bunch of potential confounders. These are the things that can cause hearing loss and loneliness. So we got to statistically control for them. And this is what they found. And I'm going to say it, you won't understand it, and then I'm going to decode it. It found an odds ratio of 1.43 per 10 decibel hearing loss increase, which was significant. What this means is that for every 10 decibels worse the hearing got, the odds, or sort of risk chance of getting lonely, went up about 1.43 times, controlling for confounders. And that's important because a 10 decibel increase in hearing loss is not actually that much. So I think this is a pretty strong association. Now let's jump into studies showing the relationship between hearing loss and dementia, cognition, and depression. This is a great study from about 10 years ago by one of my mentors and colleagues, Frank Lin from Johns Hopkins. The exposure here was hearing measured with decibel, and the outcome was new cases of dementia. That's what incident means. New cases of dementia. There were about 640 people, and it was over about a decade. And it adjusted for all these potential confounders. And this is what they found. I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to translate it into English. So first, in Greek, it showed a hazard ratio of 1.27 per 10 decibel increase in hearing loss with a significant p-value. So what that means in English is that for every 10 decibel worse the hearing got, the hazard or risk of dementia over that decade of the study went up about 1.27 times. And again, note a 10 dB increase in hearing loss is not that much. So that's a pretty strong relationship. And this can be illustrated using this graph here, which is what we call a dose-dependent relationship. So on the x-axis is the amount of hearing loss going from perfect to deaf. And on the y-axis is the hazard or risk of dementia. And what you can see is that as hearing loss increases, the risk of getting dementia over the decade goes up a lot. It kind of skyrockets. In fact, people who have severe hearing loss are about 6 times more likely to get demented over the study period, which is pretty amazing. So this caused waves across otolaryngology and broader medicine, and basically, in my opinion, kind of created a whole new field looking at the brain effects of age-related hearing loss. It's been featured in the news. Most importantly, it was featured on my Twitter. The Lancet, which is one of the most respected medical journal, publishes this thing called the Lancet Commissions, which lists risk factors for dementia. And for 2 consecutive issues, they listed hearing loss as the number one risk factor for dementia, more than diet and smoking and all these other things. They said in the most recent article, came out last year, that if you completely eliminated hearing loss, it could potentially prevent 8% of cases of dementia, which is just unbelievable. Of course, a big if we can, treat it perfectly. So one of the things I'm interested in is the relationship between minimal levels of hearing loss and cognition. And so I did a study a couple of years ago looking at this. The exposure was hearing, the outcome was cognition on a bunch of tests. And we looked at over 4,000 people with normal hearing. So these are people with normal hearing, okay? I call it subclinical hearing loss, but they basically had normal hearing loss. Single slice in time, and we adjusted for potential confounders. And now I'm going to show you the results. This was the result on one cognitive test called the DSST. And the orange range here from 20 to 46 is basically kind of the lowest and highest score people got, like 95% of the group. And the black dot, 33, is about the mean score. And the green arrow shows you how much your cognition would decline on this test. It's kind of like an IQ test. If you went from perfect hearing, 0 decibels, to still normal hearing, but just at the border of hearing loss. And you could just visually see that it makes a dent, okay? So if you went from perfect hearing to just the border between hearing loss and normal hearing, it made a difference. And we did this in the other cognitive tests, and it was significant and clinically meaningful in every single cognitive test. And I just thought that was incredible. So I think it shows you that every little bit of hearing matters. Even if you're in the normal range, hearing better normal or worse normal, that matters. And the hearing cognition relationship may begin earlier than previously recognized. Maybe we should treat it just when it starts rather than waiting until people are practically deaf. And finally, maybe the current definition for adult hearing loss is too lax. In fact, in children, it's stricter than in older adults. Whenever you have 2 standards, we call that a double standard, and that represents, ageism in this case. That's a problem. So this was featured in the New York Times. Jane Brody wrote this up. This is like the peak of my career. I can retire now. Kim Tingley wrote it up too. So this is a really exciting finding, and I'm doing some more work on this now. This slide here shows the relationship between hearing loss and depression over a few studies. The take home here is that most studies denoted by the green dot found an association, which is pretty intuitive. So just some quick conclusions. I think we can say now that hearing loss is clearly associated with cognitive impairment and depression, and the association may begin with minimal levels of hearing loss. What we don't know is whether the association is causal. We're very reluctant to use the C word, and we need more studies. We need really randomized controlled trials. But there are now changes coming because of all this evidence showing that maybe untreated age-related hearing loss is bad for you. A bill passed the House Senate was signed into law to create over-the-counter hearing aids, which should appear in drugstores any year. And there's a bunch of new studies coming out, Johns Hopkins, my university, Columbia, by my group and colleagues. And so I think we'll see a lot of exciting new data on this in the future. It was a pleasure giving this talk, and happy to be here. Thank you very much.